Yeah, I will lead off, and after I've lulled you all into some kind of sleepy state, Jill will come on and reinvigorate us all. So you have to put up with me first. Actually, I would really like to thank the organizers for having me and allowing me to speak. It's very gratifying, in actual fact, because I was one of the sort of initiators a few years ago of this policy conference, and it's really, really nice to see a full room a few years later. Anyway, we sort of move out of all of the, maybe the sort of more standard trade stuff that we've been talking about today and move into some, what might be newer areas. Now, if I can get the technology to work. What I'd like you all to do, if you can, is to think back 30 years to 1983. That was 30 years ago. Now, I realize some of you are going to have a hard time doing that because you probably weren't even here, and a lot of you were probably quite small, but as best you can, sort of try and think back about 30 years, say to 1983. I would like to suggest that there has been and only because, a lot of people actually don't really realize, there has been a sea of change in the way consumers, at least, perceive food and the way food is moved around the world in that 30-year time span. And with that has come sort of, one of this is a very heightened awareness of food safety. Now, this is in part driven by the fact there's been enormous technological improvements in how we can move food around the world in terms of logistics, in terms of packaging, in terms of sort of putting cold chains together, all of those kinds of things. So, you can basically have, and I only picked New Zealand because it's at the end of the world. Geographically, you can have, fresh New Zealand lamb in almost any market in the world today. And we have fresh vegetables from halfway around the world, and we have fruit that comes from all the way around the world. And one of the things then is these supply chains in general of the food we eat have expanded in length tremendously because of these technological innovations. And, all of a sudden, exotic parts of the world are, doing things to food. And, that sort of raises some awareness that, well, I wonder really what they're doing halfway around the world in terms of their food safety. So there's a rising awareness. Secondly, over that time span, I think there's been a major revolution in the way we sort of eat and particularly cook. 30 years ago, we still were pretty, in Canada, we had a very standard dietary situation where everything was cooked to the devil out of it, the vegetables were boiled to the devil, and so forth. So a lot of the food safety was just handled with cooking. Since then, we all like to have our rare steak, and we like to have our salad, and we like to have our vegetables that aren't cooked to the devil. And all of that, in some sense, makes things, you're doing less of really taking care of food safety in the kitchen, and it somehow more has to be done in the system. Secondly, we're eating out tremendously much more than we did 30 years ago. So the food safety isn't happening in the kitchen, it's happening in the kitchen of the restaurant. So there's like a whole sort of ramping up of the food safety. Secondly, over that same period, there's been the dimensions of food quality and what consumers are concerned about has increased tremendously. I think 1983, if I were to look back, in terms of food quality, there were three things people were worried about. They hoped it was safe, or they worried it was safe. They wanted it to be nutritious, and they wanted it to taste good. And that was about it. Now, over the years, different consumers are interested in different things, but some people want, I want all these other things, nutrition and so forth, but I also want the food I eat to have a low environmental footprint, or I want it to be organic, or I want it to be produced in animal welfare-friendly ways, or I want it, I want to know where it came from, and that might be right back to a farm, or what country, and so forth. Does it contain genetically modified organisms or not? Or was it produced with, I don't want to eat food that was produced with child labor somewhere halfway around the world. So in that, and I really believe that none of those things were really on the radar of agricultural policy, trade policy, or any of the things 30 years ago. Now, why I wanted to stress that was that the Uruguay round started in 1986. The agenda for the Uruguay round had to be made somewhere between 1980 and 83 and 1986 when they were getting what they were going to negotiate. Nothing's been put on the agenda since then in terms of agricultural trade negotiations. We got through Uruguay, got partway there to deal with all the three-pillar problems of subsidies and trade barriers and so forth. Doha just extended that agenda. Nothing new came on the agenda. So in terms of the international regulatory system, all of this huge sea of change in terms of thinking about food safety and thinking about all these other dimensions of food quality have never been on the international trade agenda and aren't. And in actual fact, although there's been a little bit of discussion today about regional trade agreements, none of them have really bitten the bullet and really want to talk about that. So, in any case, given the heightened awareness of food safety and the multiple new dimensions of food quality, and if these things matter, you actually do have to have some kind of standards. You do have to have some kind of standards to say, well, does this actually contain GMOs or not? Right? Or what tolerance of GMOs is it allowed? Or what kind of environmental footprint is it going to have? Or, all of these things really, really are, somewhere along the line, have to have some standards. Now, they could be mandatory standards done by the governments, or they could be voluntarily led by industry and done by industry and so forth. But you do need to have standards. Right? Secondly, if you're going to have standards and you're going to say this is going to be GMO-free or this is going to be organic or whatever, you also have to be able to tell people, which means somehow the consumers need to know about this, and that's largely done through labeling, and that requires all sorts of labeling policy. Lots of research on, the way you make labels really matters, and so forth. And if you're going to have labels and you're going to have these standards, you also have some people to make sure that what's put on the label, and if you have these standards, that somebody is complying. So you need to have some kinds of certification systems to to ensure that the standards you put in place are actually happening, and that could be public or private. So there's a huge sort of sea of change in the public policy arena. And, that's, so there's a whole bunch of policy questions. Should the standards be public or should they be private? And these are just domestic discussions. And in the great scheme of things, if we put these different kinds of standards in place, the trade people are interested. Are they trade diverting, or are they trade reducing, or are they trade enhancing? And there's a lot of sort of empirical kind of work that sort of goes around there. The government, in terms of policy, are saying, well, if we do these kinds of standards, or other countries are doing these kind of standards, what's it mean for exporters? And in some sense, if I'm going to put standards for policymakers, if I'm going to put standards in place, what might be the trade effects? Something like that. So I'm going to talk largely a little bit about what goes on in public standards, and then Jill will go on and deal with the sort of private issues. Right? Public standards are mandatory in the sense that, the government's making, the government's involved to make them mandatory. So in other words, it puts in a legal obligation for compliance. And what the economics would tell us is that these should be, where am I at? Oop. I remember to do this. That these should be, some kind of response to market failures. That's what the economics would tell us, to somehow correct for negative externalities that come from things. That's sort of the food safety problems, public goods, things like the environment, and so forth. If there's a market failure, the government needs to get in and make these regulations, or problems of information asymmetry. In other words, that some people in the supply chain have more information than others, and you have to intervene to overcome that kind of market failure. Again, that gets into the labeling policies. The objective, in theory, at least for public standards, is that you're trying to, achieve a socially optimal level of food safety or environmental protection or whatever is in there. And we have, lots and lots of examples of mandatory food safety. For instance, mandatory HACCP all through food supply chains is one. Actually, it's quite interesting. I would think that the new U.S. Food Safety Modernization Act, if you haven't looked at it, sort of takes the public standards to a whole new level, or is going to, in terms of food safety, including mandatory inspections often inspections of foreign facilities, and even to the point of, say, specifying correct agronomic practices for food safety in foreign countries, and much, much more. So, there is this sort of ramping up, in some sense, internationally, I think, of, depending on what countries are doing, to try and deal in that kind of regulatory way with food safety. And then, on the sort of environmental side, there's, things like pesticide residue limits, pollution regulations, wastewater treatment, all of those kinds of things that, governments get into regulating again, trying to, offset some kind of market failure that might be out there. Okay, we need to go a little further. I'm going to slide behind. All right. Come on. Okay, and again, domestic governments are putting in all sorts of, responding to, say, people's concerns about animal welfare, consumers' worries about those things. European Union, recently banned cages for layer hens, and there's bans on confinement pens for sows in the European Union and the U.S. And on top of that, a whole, slew of, to go with these things, labeling and certification. Mandatory nutrition labeling, we're all familiar with that. National organic standards in the European Union, EU, US. Certified food safety practices that are coming through, say, in the United States Food Safety Modernization Act. And with all of that comes a whole bunch of certifications of everything right down to the laboratories that are going to check all of these things, and the lab, even the qualifications of the laboratory, the people who work in those labs, and again, who certifies the certifiers. So there's a whole bunch of sort of deepening public standards. The problem for government is that there's very little coordination. There's virtually no international coordination of this stuff. And different countries have different standards. If you ever had to look at that, I mean, you had to look between us and the European Union where, genetically modified products are a no-go. Where in Canada, we sort of there are some standards, but we haven't sort of banned the product or something. So, different countries have different social objectives and priorities and resources and so forth, right? So you get different standards in different countries. Immediately you have different standards in different countries, they can become a barrier to trade. You don't meet our standards. Therefore, either you're going to have to spend a lot of money to reach our standards, which might be different from yours, or you just can't come into our market because you don't reach our standards. So while there's this, big demand for all of these new regulations for all of these new attributes and so forth, they can have potentially negative trade. They can have potentially negative trade effects, they can have potentially negative trade effects, and even worries in the sense that you may get. If you put in, say, high animal welfare standards or high environmental standards, you get this problem that you actually create other countries that want to become pollution, or not maybe want to become, but see an advantage of becoming a pollution haven or a low animal welfare haven and so forth. That creates, these sort of problems. Well, how do we provide disincentives for that to happen? Certainly when you, say, raise your animal welfare standards, it raises the costs for your producers, and that makes them less competitive, say, with countries that don't have those kind of standards. So that leads to pressures to regulate, restrict imports, do things like, big discussions about environmental tariffs, so that if your agriculture is done in an environmentally less friendly way than ours, we should be able to put up trade barriers to offset that disadvantage we've put on and so forth. So this becomes there's very little coordination. It becomes a real challenge for governments. Every time they try to put a regulation in, there's likely to be some kind of trade problem or trade difficulty that may arise. Right. So what do the rules actually say? What do the rules that we actually have to say? And just again, remember that Doha, the WTO, the agenda was set way back in 1983, before any of these big changes came along. So what does the WTO actually have to say? Largely works off some very, very basic principles that have been there for a long time. The principle of non-discrimination, which works on the idea, one of the ideas central to that is that like products cannot be discriminated against. So if you have a like product, you can't discriminate in your legislation or in the way you do trade for products that are considered the same. And one of the things that was in the original negotiations, these are the negotiations, that came out of previous rounds of negotiations, was that like products cannot be defined as not being like based on how they are produced. You cannot put up a trade barrier based on something being a different product based on how it is produced. If you go back and look at all of those things that deal with animal welfare, environmental friendly, GMO or not, all of those things are how things are produced. So you're not really allowed to put up trade barriers for all of these kinds of things that we might, that the food system has become a concern for policymakers, but you're not allowed to put up trade barriers based on how things are produced. National treatment means imported products must be treated equally with domestic, like products. So you can't have special regulations for foreigners, even if you're, sort of worried about maybe what's going on in their food safety a long way away. You can't have different kinds of regulations. And again, all foreigners must be treated the same. So, there's sort of all sorts of things that you can't do. Make people have special labels based on the animal welfare or child labor or whatever something was produced in the public sector. So these are the default principles in some sense, unless there are exceptions. And there are some exceptions granted in the old GATT, and this stems from before Uruguay. GATT Article 20, there are general exceptions. You're allowed to have trade measures to protect public morals, for animal health, life, and so forth, and related to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. Sorry, I keep running behind here. And on exhaustible natural resources. In general, the case law and so forth, in things like the U.S. shrimp turtle case, which was about environmental sustainability, where the U.S. tried to put some trade barriers in place to discourage fishing methods for shrimp that were negatively impacted on turtles. And in some sense, this exception really wasn't allowed to pertain in that kind of case. There's lots of case law around it. The other major exception that's never really been used, I don't think, very much, is the one called public morals. You could put a trade barrier based on moral arguments. That might apply to animal welfare. I think there is going to be a case coming up very soon where the European Union Parliament has banned imports of seal products from Canada. On what basis? That the public thinks whatever we do in Canada is morally corrupt or something. So, and we're going to get some cases out of that. Right? But most of these kind of things were actually in the Uruguay round shunted off to a couple of side agreements in the Uruguay round. One was the SPS Agreement, the Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, which basically permits measures that are necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life and health. You could put trade barriers up for those reasons, but they must be based on science and a scientific risk assessment. What we find, however, is that while that is what the agreed rules are, in some countries, you're getting resistance from consumers saying, we don't really care what the scientists say. We don't care if the scientists say it's safe. Either we don't believe the scientists, or even if it is safe, we don't want these products in our markets. There is, within the SPS, reference to having international standards. A little bit was alluded to this morning, I think, the Codex Alimentarius and the Animal, the International Office of Epizootics, which has a new name, and the Plant Protection Agency all are charged with setting up standards, but they've proved to be extremely cumbersome. They weren't set up to deal with the standards, that the kinds of questions that have happened over the last 30 years. They're very slow, they're consensus-based, and they're really, really, really not up to the speed at which things need to be done. And again, only applies to public regulatory standards. There's a Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, the other agreement. The Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement really deals with all of these things like labeling and technical standards and packaging and all of these kinds of things that largely the new domestic regulatory regimes have had to try and deal with. Again, these must conform to the GATT principles of non-discrimination. Like products should be treated the same. And in essence, although it's a little bit ambiguous and the trade lawyers fight over this, in essence, again, you cannot put up trade barriers based on how something is produced differently, right? So again, the TBT agreement doesn't really address what the problems are today. And again, it applies only to public mandatory standards. Lessons from the experience. There's been some WTO Dispute Panel rulings in the sort of idea where you could try to use trade barriers to foster environmental agendas, both in the U.S. shrimp turtle and the tuna dolphin case. Trade barriers were disallowed by the WTO, based again, at least to some extent, on that how you fish things is a production process, right? And therefore you're not allowed to do these kinds of things under the agreements. There was a case, a very famous case, I guess, where the European Union banned imports of beef produced using growth hormones that are used extensively all over the world, in North America, Canada, the United States, and so forth, and Australia and so forth, that basically said we don't want these products in our market, we're going to eliminate them. We have a lot of consumer resistance. WTO case, Canada and the United States brought. We won. There was no scientific basis and no risk assessment done by the European Union, and we won the case based on that basis. Following that, an even bigger case, the European Union had an import ban on genetically modified products. Again, it was supposed to be it was somewhat of a temporary ban until they rejigged the regulations. But again, because it was basically, again, not based on science and not based on risk assessments, we won the case. So again, those kind of judgments, the WTO, following, not really trying to deal with these things, have certainly come down with some judgments. And there's a whole bunch of, sort of impending things. The European Union is trying to put stuff into the WTO and animal welfare and so forth. There's a bunch of pending stuff. So, while the WTO mandatory standards, however, carry a legal obligation to comply, there has been what I would call considerable slippage. One of the problems is that the actual model, the economic model that underlies the WTO, never expected consumers to want trade barriers. All the models I ever, you sort of teach in your class is that who wants trade barriers? Producers, because that gives them higher prices. Presumably, if you take trade barriers away, prices come down, consumers are happy. No one ever thought in 1947, when they set up the WTO, that consumers would actually ask for trade restrictions, which is what we're getting. Almost all of the major new trade issues, not the ones that we were talking about this morning about subsidies and all of those things, the major new trade issues that the WTO is supposed to deal with are consumer and or environmental issues. And the WTO, in some sense, has no way in itself to deal with a country that comes and says, I've got a real problem with my consumers. They don't want to have GMO products in the market. What are the rules, right? I mean, there's no way for the WTO to actually deal with that under the rules, and nobody ever thought that would ever arise. So what's happened? What do we have slippage? Well, we won the case on beef produced during growth hormones, and under its right, the European Union said, we will not comply. We will not comply, and we will accept retaliation. So Canada and the United States dutifully put up retaliatory barriers against European Union products, but the barrier to beef products produced with growth hormones did not come down. Right? After 10 years, and I was actually quite disappointed with this, after 10 years of retaliatory sanctions, the U.S. and Canada sort of gave up and took some small concessions on import quotas and basically abandoned the principle that science should determine these things. Europeans were not going to change. Secondly, the European Union ban on GMOs. In 2006, in the face of the panel ruling from the WTO, the EU said, we will put our new regime in place and it will be WTO compliant. At least some of my own research suggests, we've been doing lately, it is not. Now, we'll have to wait now for a case to go forward if someone actually is brave enough to bring a case forward. But again, the principles are there. It's not happening, right? There's a huge problem arising now with what is known with GMs known as advantageous presence, where this is where, say, a GM product is approved in one market and not in another, but you get some kind of contamination in export shipments that show up in, say, a place like the European Union, which bans the imports. They have zero tolerance. That's a standard. They have zero tolerance for imports. And the shipments are reduced or refused. And there's lots and lots of cost. This would happen to the Canadian flax industry. There was some mingling of GM and non-approved GM products with regular non-GM products. Shut our whole industry out of Europe. More and more and more GM products are being approved in the countries that approve them. The problems of contamination get bigger. Right? So, and then there's all these other things that are just creeping away. Their animal welfare standards and labor standards and so forth. So essentially, for 30 years, you haven't even been able to get these things on the agenda of the WTO. Nothing's happened. There is a great big void. And when there's a void in regulatory things, somebody steps in, and I'll turn that over to Jill.
So as Bill says, with a void, meanwhile, what we see is a proliferation of private standards for food safety and quality. So I'm just going to take a few minutes, I'm conscious of the time, just to talk a little bit about some examples of private standards for food safety and quality, some of the economic functions of those, and then think about some of the trade implications of private standards. And when we think about private standards, there's sort of two ways to think about them. One is their source and scope, and the second would be their economic function. So in terms of source and scope, and I'll give you examples of these in just a minute, but a number of the private standards that we see emerging are voluntary, what we call voluntary consensus standards. So these will be standards established by coalitions of firms or across industry sectors, may or may not involve government in a facilitating role to help establish the standard or provide the regulatory framework for operation of the standard. Other standards are purely proprietary, individual firm standards, and then we also see a growth of third-party standards coming out of NGOs or another independent standard-setting body. So let's take a quick look at some of those. Probably the best-known voluntary consensus standard is Global GAP, where GAP stands for Good Agricultural Practices. This began life, as many people will probably know, as Europe GAP, where a coalition of European food retailers came together to establish a common set of food safety standards and good agricultural practice standards for their suppliers. And this runs across a number of sectors: fruit and vegetables, livestock, flowers, combinable crops, and so on and so forth. And encompasses both food safety management practices, environmental practices, animal welfare, worker health and safety. So many of the same kinds of issues that Bill was touching on in the context of public standards. So that's at the retailer end of the supply chain. Interestingly, we also see voluntary consensus standards that emerge from the producer end of the supply chain. So I've just got a couple of examples up here. One of the interesting ones coming out a few years ago out of the UK was the Assured Food Standards System. So again, this was the initiative for this came from a coalition of producer groups, so it's cross-sectorial, again focusing on some of the same issues that we see from the retailer food safety or standards, food safety, animal welfare and environment. With an important difference, I think, a subtle difference perhaps, is that often the adoption of that standard is signaled to consumers with that little red tractor logo that we see up there. And I'll come to this point in a minute in terms of thinking about the functions of a standard, because by and large the global gap standards that we see are not, I would argue anyway, not intended necessarily as a consumer signal. That's not true to the same extent of this particular example coming out of the UK. And then moving closer to home, we have Canada Gap. I'm not going to say too much about that because I think Heather will say more about that and is far more knowledgeable than I am about Canada Gap, but basically a food safety management program for producers and packers and so forth of fruits and vegetables in Canada following a HACCP system. And as I understand that program is set to merge with the Canadian Produce Marketing Association's Food Quality Safety Program, taking more of a supply chain approach. So another example of what we would describe as a voluntary consensus standard coming from the industry, and I'll leave Heather to talk a little bit more about that. One of the issues with the growth of private standards was a recognition that often there was an issue of duplication, multiplication. So if a number of retailers had individual proprietary standards, becoming a challenge for suppliers in terms of having to certify to a whole bunch of different standards. So I had an interesting initiative a few years ago, and I'll come back to talking about this in the context of trade implications of private standards later, but with the Global Food Safety Institute. So this was put in place by the Consumer Goods Forum, initially again retailer-driven, with the intention to improve food safety management systems. This isn't, they don't establish a standard, basically they're a forum for trying to consolidate or certify, benchmark existing private food safety standards. So they certify a whole bunch of existing private standards, and I've just got a few there up on the screen. Canada Gap, as I understand, was one of the first Canadian standards to get certified by GFSI. So their purpose is to try and establish a common benchmark, a common framework for establishing these private food safety standards. And again, responding to perhaps some of the concern that you can have issues of duplication and proliferation of individual standards. So those are examples of voluntary consensus standards. We also see, of course, standards that come out of third parties, either NGOs or independent standard-setting bodies. I suppose ISO would be the best-known example, where you've got quality management and environmental standards established by ISO. But again, also a number of other third parties. If we think about animal welfare, SPCA has a set of animal welfare standards and so on. And a number of us in the Consumer Market Demand Network have looked at some of these issues around certification of standards and who do consumers trust for these kinds of quality signals. And then lastly, they're what we might think of as proprietary standards, just individual firms' standard requirements. Again, one of the earlier ones you tend to see talked about in the literature would be coming out of the UK. Tesco's is a major food retailer in the UK. Tesco's Nature's Choice program was established back, I think, in the early 1990s, again as an attempt to have a set of standards for suppliers. Whole Foods in the US, Walmart would be other examples of proprietary standards. So we can think about private standards as coming in those three categories: voluntary consensus standards, third-party standards, and proprietary firm-level standards. We can also think about them in terms of their economic function. They don't all perform the same function. They don't necessarily all have the same objective. And I kind of think about these functions in three categories. Some of these standards are clearly primarily about product differentiation. They're about sending signals to consumers through labeling about the various credence attributes within those products. That would be true clearly of the proprietary standards, Tesco standard. Perhaps to a degree, those assured food standards in the UK. It's also trying to send a signal about origin. I would argue that's probably not what Global Gap's about. It's not really a consumer signal. What Global Gap's about is supply chain management. It's reducing the transaction costs of sourcing food, reducing liability, protecting the reputation for firms. So I think it's important to recognize that these private standards, that they may do all three. Some might be more focused on supply chain management and liability issues than on product differentiation. I've already maybe touched on the second point there. Clearly, there's also a role for third-party verification or certification of private standards. And some of us, as I said, have looked at the sort of acceptance of those types of systems. And a number of people have recognized that, yes, these are voluntary standards, but they can be, in effect, de facto mandatory if the majority of the market adopts them. Let me just turn to one more question about standards in a trade context. And there's been some very good work that's been done by a number of people in the room, including Julie Caswell over here, looking at this issue of whether standards do they divert, do they reduce trade, or do they enhance trade? A lot of that empirical work, of course, has looked at public standards less, but some of it has also looked at the same questions with respect to private standards. So I just want to say just a few words looking at the arguments on both sides of that debate. So the first side of the debate, private standards, and some of these comments apply to public standards, but not all. Are they trade diverting or reducing? What would be the arguments? Well, clearly one of them is if the compliance costs are significant for the standards, then that can inhibit trade and inhibit investment. Spencer Henson out of Guelph has done some work also in that area. A lot of the analysis generally recognizes that standards tend to have, both public and private standards, tend to have a higher burden on exporters from countries that have lower public and private standards. And clearly that's particularly a challenge for developing countries. So the compliance cost argument is one argument about why private standards might be trade reducing. Also, again, this matters now if we're talking about proprietary or consensus standards, but the extent to which those standards require asset-specific investments by suppliers. In other words, do they lock suppliers into dealing with specific retailers down the supply chain? If so, does that create a risk of hold-up, of the business relationship breaking down? And that can be exacerbated by increased concentration in the retail sector, where a few firms have control the access to global supply chains. And again, clearly that's likely to be more of an issue with proprietary standards. Consensus standards, to an extent, try to address that issue. And of course, unlike public standards, there's no mechanism for challenge of a trade-restricting private standard by trading partners. The other side of the coin, the other arguments would be, well, no, maybe private standards can in fact be trade facilitating. And the strongest argument here relates to the recognition that some people have made that harmonization and mutual recognition appears to be happening faster in some cases in the private sphere than with public standards. So the Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI, I just talked about, would be an example of that. So maybe having that harmonization is happening more quickly among private standards than is happening with public standards. Clearly, again, if we're talking about these consensus standards, potentially they offer access to global supply chains across multiple retailers in multiple countries. And if that's true, then maybe, in fact, they enhance access to other markets. And another observation that some of the work has looked at the extent to which standards, encourage quality upgrading. Do they encourage product differentiation? Do they encourage the adoption of improved technologies and therefore lead to differentiated markets and enhanced trade? So I think there's been some very good empirical work looking at this question, and clearly a scope for more work, and particularly maybe looking at the issue of private standards in that context. Just a couple of words on developing country implications, and many people have recognized that both public and private standards can be a challenge for developing countries in terms of costs of compliance, the capacity for verification, certification, and testing can be an issue for developing countries. Clearly, discriminatory mandatory public standards could be challenged through WTO mechanisms, although Bill has outlined some of the challenges in doing that, but obviously the WTO has no jurisdiction over private standards. Excuse me. I just swallowed loads of ice cubes. That was not smart. Excuse me. Right, where was I? Yeah, so WTO obviously has no jurisdiction over private standards. There's some kind of nebulous language in the SPS Agreement that says that member states should take reasonable measures to ensure that, quote, non-governmental entities comply with the SPS Agreement, but that's not clearly defined. And possibly some clarification in the TBT Agreement. So just to offer some concluding comments so we can move on to the discussants. The extension of WTO jurisdiction over private standards, of course, it's not going to happen. That's hard to envision. That's not, and clearly not the purpose of the WTO. So they're here to stay. They're going to gain in importance and in influence, and in many senses are a market response to changing consumer preferences and the need to reduce supply chain liabilities. Are they trade enhancing or trade diverting? I think that remains an open question. There's plenty of scope for more empirical work in that direction. And I think also a relevant question is the potential role for the public sector in facilitating voluntary quality verification and certification. And this is my last slide, which is good because my voice is about to go. As Bill has indicated, doesn't appear likely that there's going to be any progress at the WTO in the context of reducing non-tariff measures. The development of harmonized public standards at Codex, at the OIE, IPCC are very slow, as he said, and cumbersome, and we think private standards continue to proliferate. So I shall leave it there and hand over to the next speaker. Thanks.